So thanks to everyone for coming. I need a lot of people for a first event, so it's great to see at least this many people. So why make a group? Me and Chris signed up for the Angular group in London, but for us to get into London was quite often it was a bit hard to get to. It was late in the evening, we'd have to hire a hotel probably. And there seems to be quite a few web development groups and JavaScript orientated groups in London, but none really for the Thames Valley area, which was a bit crazy considering we've got Green Park, we have Thames Valley Park, the companies in town itself. Plus there was a group I used to go to down in Woking, which was great, but that kind of fell apart, so we started this one. It's only really going to be successful if people step up and are willing to give presentations as well. I mean, I have a few contacts for some names that we can get in to give talks, hopefully, but I'm also going to rely on other people giving talks. So this is the kind of stuff we have in mind in terms of potential topics and areas of interest. Now, there's bound to be other areas, frameworks, languages that I haven't covered. And as far as I'm concerned, I would love to hear talks on frameworks that I've never heard about. You know, introduction talks, that sort of thing. So, in terms of the event format, if you look at this right-hand side, there's two ways we could run events. We could have them down the pub, which is nice, there's beer, it's a bit more social. The downside is it can be harder to get hold of a projector or a quiet room. You'll find some pubs have a separate room that you can hire out. I've been to a few that had a format like that, it worked quite well. You can get food as well. In terms of like the talk format, I've been to plenty of meetups where talks can just be like 10 minutes long and really impromptu. So you could almost have an event where there's no predefined schedule, but people are turning up and they just might want to talk about something fancy they've learned last week. We can do more in-depth talks, deep dive talks, but chances are if it's not something you're interested in, you're going to get pretty bored. We could even do sort of show and tell or design showcases. So I'm not a web design person, I'm not great at CSS or anything like that, so my sites look awful, but other people might be really good with Flash and HTML5, and so getting some showcase stuff like that would be great as well. Are you okay to pick a Jake? He's up first.
Will do.
In terms of what I've got there, does anyone want to shout out any other sort of things that might be interesting? Signal, yeah, definitely. So I put WebSockets there. I was going to put like Socket.io and stuff. A bit specific, but yeah, definitely stuff like that. So sort of cutting edge web technology stuff like Signal, Socket.io, push events, stuff like that would be great. I personally am very interested in that.
And web development, you like things like PhoneGap or Firebase or something like that?
Yeah, I mean like phone frameworks for, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'd be interested in that.
Maybe like SEO, if anyone's into SEO, I don't know if there's any search engine guys.
Yeah, I'd be interested, definitely. We will, this is being recorded, so all of these sort of responses will be recorded. So I'm going to hand you over to Jamie first, who's going to talk about GruntJS.
Okay, my name is Jamie, work at Semantic. I've been a QA for a long time, feels like probably 7 years. I've been doing web development on the side for like forever really. All this sort of front-end UI stuff is all, you know, it's all going the JavaScript route. Grunt is one of those things that sits on top of Node. So just a show of hands first, JavaScript, Node, are these alien phrases to people? No? Cool. Grunt, anyone heard of Grunt before? Yeah. Cool, let's hope I don't get answered. Cool, so this is a very high level talk about what Grunt is. I've been using it for a couple of weeks, just sort of trying to find my way around it. So yeah, we'll see how far we can go. So what Grunt is it's basically a task runner. You get all these packages, you can build up your own packages. Whatever you tell it to run, it will run. It sits on top of Node.js, so it's cross-platform because Node can run on Linux and Macs and PCs and Windows. JavaScript-based because Node is JavaScript-based, and basically anything you can do in Node, you can do in Grunt. So you've got access to HTTP networking, file system, crypto libraries if you really want to go down that route. It's a bit like Node Package Manager. Well, no, actually, no, not a bit like Node Package Manager. Node Package Manager has modules which are installable for Grunt. It's very extendable, so you can make your own. You can make your own packages. If the package doesn't exist, yeah, that's cool. If one does exist but it doesn't do what you want, fork it on GitHub. Everything's open source these days, pretty good. A couple of packages which we find quite useful internally are ones that do compression. Oh, I just spotted mine. Should I wear that thing?
No worries.
That's right. There's ones that do compression, so you can give it a folder, say compressible base. Copy for copy to remote shares in different file servers. Coffee can pass CoffeeScript. CSS lint and JS hinting, so make sure that you're not doing bad things with your JavaScript and your CSS. That's really, the bigger boys are using it, so like Twitter, jQuery Foundation, Adobe, WordPress, Walmart, I find are using it. They've got 2 libraries of files. Cool. So as I said, it's a task runner. So I think I said whatever you tell it to do, it will do. It's got 2 modes. There's a sequential mode, so obviously sequentially it will just do what it's told, and there's asynchronous mode, so obviously go and do all this stuff at the same time. It's quite nice. Multiple task configurations will make a little bit of sense when I show you the demo, but essentially you can have a task which, dependent on the parameters that you give it, will run different configurations. So if there's any questions while I'm doing this, then shout out and I'll do my best to answer. So what are we using it for? We're using it for code validation, CSS, JavaScript. We're running all our unit tests off of it. We're minifying our code, and we're distributed program. I think what that meant was we're basically zipping all of our code up into a nice folder structure to give to QA. And that's called the minified versions of our stuff, and then it pulls in the minified versions of like Angular and Bootstrap and all those ones. So, that sort of saves on round trips to the server when they actually deploy it. Cool. So gruntfile.js. This is the configuration file for Grunt. If you go into a folder structure and you have Grunt installed and you run Grunt, the first thing it'll do is it'll look for this gruntfile.js. Hopefully you can read this. Doesn't go too far back. This is sort of something I figured was a nice basic one. Has anybody heard of Mocha? It's like karma testing frameworks. That's all. So all this is doing is it's defining the packages that you're going to run and the parameters that it's going to take in. So if we take this one, it's going to run Mocha, which is the testing framework, with these options. So it's got a spec or speak reporter, that we know how to pronounce that, and then the files that it's going to execute against are in the folder structure. Ignore the load npm task, we'll get on that in a bit. The very last line, which is grunt.register task, that is how you define a task from the command line. So if you go into the command line and you type in grunt, like I said, the first thing it goes and does is find the grunt file, and it'll run the default one if you don't have any other tasks or any other register tasks. And then that Mocha test is in an array, so you can chain that into as many other tasks as you want. Obviously, you can make your own one, so you'd have one that was test, and it can do multiple things, build, do loads of different multiple things.
Sorry. Yep. Can you, in some way, say everything rather than list every single one of the?
So I'm not actually sure.
Because you're doing an int config, now you're defining
Yes.
them in there, and I suspect that's.
I'm not sure. I've not tried that. I haven't found a link for that one yet. Because you could have these that would have loads of different things. You'd be doing minification, unit tests, and whether you'd want to run all of those at the same time. In the next slide, I'll show you the multiple configurations. So in this one, you see under mocker test, we have an object that's just called test. So that is just doing one action. I'll show you the next one. I'll get smaller, great. So actually, this is so inside mocker test, we now have two different objects. One's called test and one's called performance. So if you ran grunt mocker test, it would run everything that was inside that. So it would run the test group and it would run the performance group. As you can see, these have different parameters. So the reporter for the first one is spec, so to speak. Reporter for the second one is list. So it's just, you might want them put differently. And you can run different sets of tests in my case. So I'm doing the test. One could be random unit tests, and the second one could be sort of performance-based ones, timing, different sort of things. And then if you want a really quick way of just running the performance ones, I've registered a task called perf. So you do grunt space perf on the command line, and it would only run mocker test performance. That's how that would run. This sort of goes on to your question. My really crappy answer to your question is, how would you run a lot of things? So this is one which I've sort of done. So our build one goes in JS hints, CSS lints, recesses, minifies, mocker tests, distributes, compresses, and then notifies some random server.
And I take it grunt runs once when you invoke it. It's
Yes.
not something that's running all the time. So if you want to integrate this with CI, you have your version control change triggering grunt.
Well, in that case, yes. So you could have Visual Studio could, as a build step, could. Sorry. As a build stack from Visual Studio, you could just get it to check out your code and just run grunt in that folder. So you could have it as an event-based system, or in development, there's a grunt package called watch. So it'll watch for any changes on CSS or JavaScript. So you've got your ID up on one side, grunt up, or your console up on the other. And as soon as you make a change, it goes and runs whatever you've told it to watch on. So sort of what's that called? Iterative, continuous development, continuous integration, something like that. One of those things.
A buzzword.
Yeah, buzzword. Cool. So what sort of overview of what this does? I tried to make it really simple because I didn't want to overload people with science. So what this is going to do is, honestly, it's stupidly simple. It's got 3 JavaScript files: global, other, and something else. I'm not even going to show you them because they are horrible. It was like add a number together, print something out. It's really rubbish. But all you're going to do is there's 3 of them. And if we run grunt, what it's going to do is it's going to concatenate all those files together into a file called build.js. And then this package called uglify, which I found out after I did this, I forgot that it actually does the concatenation for you, but we'll gloss over that one. What uglify does, if I could make it, what uglify does is it will what's uglify do? Oh yeah, so it'll minify everything together. So the concatenation will just dump the files one on top of the other, and uglify will minify the whole lot. And I've enabled something called mangling, function variable mangling. So you've got nice variables like my great variable name, and it'll shrink them all down into ABC, sort of obfuscates your code of type. And that will output build.min.js, and it'll give us a nice report about how much space we've saved by minifying and amplifying. So, let me get out of this view.
Shift, no accident.
Shift, what was that one? Shift. Quit. Get away. Oh, right. Sorry about this. You can tell that I did a lot of crap. Cool. Okay. So I've got my console tool. And this one, I don't know how I can make that bigger, so we're just going to have to deal with this one. So inside the JavaScript folder, like I said, there's 3 files. If I run grunt, assume I got this right, it will concatenate those files into JavaScript/build. And the next thing in that list was to uglify it. So we'll take that build.js, minify it, and we get a nice little bit that says the original was 1,009 bytes, minified was 518 gzip, went to 179, which is all nice for UI and phones and things, so all makes it nice and small. Sorry, back into my IDE, if I can get it. So this is sort of the in-between file. So build.js pulled all these files together and min put it all into one master big line that comes through. And just for reference for anybody, A was not called A before, this was that variable mangling that I was talking about. And I think that's it.
Could you go back to your grunt file?
Yeah.
Sorry.
On the demo?
The demo you had, yes.
Yep. Yes, I think we explained that very well.
There was, right at the top of your config, you imported a JSON package. Package JSON.
Yeah, that was just something that didn't actually work. So I took up one bit of it. I'll explain. There's a way that you can have banners to each of your files with uglify, with a concat. So if you wanted to display copyright information, so semantic insistent, you put copyright version, that's a massive big bit on top of every file. Rather than having to remember to actually do that, you can have it as a grunt task. So that was going to be used for that, but it didn't work when I was writing this.
And is there any way when you create a new grunt file that you can have that grunt file built up, so to speak, at runtime from multiple files? Or do you have to have this one monolithic grunt file?
That's a good question. I know that there's a parameter that you can pull in a different grunt file to the default one, but whether you can combine them all, I'm not sure. Just sort of trying to get a use case. What would be your reasoning for having multiple ones? And this is sort of.
I'm imagining that you'll have lots of these tasks, so concat and uglify, and a number of them, possibly each with a lot of different config in.
Yeah.
And it may just be simpler to manage that with separate
I see.
files.
It's for management ways. Yeah. So the way that this might show a tiny bit. I know it's not exactly what you were going for, but let me show it. You could register different run tasks to pull in different ones, but again, that doesn't solve your management problem with using multiple tasks.
Jamie, one thing we do is that parse JSON at the top. That will just give you a JSON object. So typically you can use that for split out all your options, the configuration options into a separate file. And then a lot of these tasks, you can strip the task down into 1 or 2 lines instead of doing separate those.
The last slide was thank you, any questions, and I can't figure out how to get back. So, thank you, any questions?
Just
wondering about when you got the load, the node package manager.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Where's that coming out in front of? That's presumably so that it knows what that disk is.
Yeah.
The open file is.
Exactly. So, like I said, it uses Node Package Manager (npm) to pull in all the different types of all the different packages. And like I said, that's basically just pulling in that package. So Grunt knows that's like a require in.
Okay. So does it have to go off? Does it have somewhere it can store those?
Yes.
Once it's got it once.
Node modules.
Okay.
Yeah, so you do npm install grunt contrib concat, and it puts it into node module, so it's all within the same thing.
Cool. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you very much.
It's great. Okay. Right, my name's Ben Haming. My talk is about AngularJS. Now, before I give this talk, can I get a show of hands who's heard of it? Okay, who's using it? Okay, it's not too bad. This might be a bit boring for everyone then. Kind of assumes that no one's heard about it. There's some demo stuff in there as well, so hopefully those of you that have heard of it have just heard of it as a passing reference and haven't actually played with it. So I'll go into that. There's a nice little picture there. The documentation for AngularJS is notoriously bad. So what you find as you're doing this Angular stuff is, you first start playing with it like, oh neat, that's really cool, two-way binding. And then you try and do something a bit more complicated, and there's no documentation. But then you find someone on Stack Overflow. And that's pretty much what the process has been like for me and my team, is that roller coaster. But it is very cool. So another disclaimer, I'm not great at JavaScript. So if you see any errors, shout them out, help me out. So what is it? It's an open source JavaScript framework. It was developed internally at Google, I think in 2009. And it's now kind of maintained by them as well. It extends your native HTML syntax. So it kind of bolts on all these additional HTML elements that you can use. It tries to emphasize declarative UI programming. Now I ripped that straight from Wikipedia. But what it means is it kind of tries to force your hand to write your UI very declaratively, and you don't mix your code in there, and you abstract your HTML away from your back-end data source. And if you write just in Angular, it actually becomes quite hard to go back to the old way of doing things and mixing in jQuery and whatnot. It de-emphasizes DOM manipulation. So you never have to touch jQuery again, which is beautiful. And in your JavaScript, you never do like a find ID and find element. You never traverse in the DOM. So it's wonderful from that regard. I made this last one up, but I think it's true. It was designed for aiding the creation of single-page applications. Okay? So single-page applications, for those of you who aren't familiar with them, the aim of a single-page app is to create an application or a site that fits on one page. So you're not going back and forth to the server to request index.html and then something else.html. So you start getting an experience which is more like your traditional native apps. Okay, so you're navigating around, the UI is all nice and fluid, and most importantly, there's no page reloads. So I've called out what I think are some of the big features of Angular. The top one being it's very much MVC orientated, and it's very hard to write code that isn't MVC orientated. Declarative two-way data binding, I'll show you a little demo of that. But what that means is you can write your HTML in this very declarative manner, and you can write your JavaScript that doesn't really reference the DOM or any sort of IDs. And Angular kind of handles the talking of the two. It has dynamic templating. So some of you might have seen server-side templating. It's got dynamic templating client-side as well. which I'll show you. Everything's based around dependency injection in Angular. So in your JavaScript, if you need to use, say, one of Angular's built-in components, you kind of just refer to it by name, and Angular takes care of instantiating that object, providing it to you, etc. I've mentioned this one, there's loads of new HTML directives or tags. So even if you used Angular just for its extra HTML tags and you didn't dive into the back-end JavaScript stuff, you're still getting quite a lot out of the box. And it's built from the ground up to be unit testable. I hope to show you a demo of the unit testing, but I ran out of time. So maybe for a future talk, for those of you that are using Angular, there's a lot of knowledge I think we can share around unit testing Angular. Because again, the documentation's a bit sparse, but we've kind of gone through a few headaches. So, model view controller, this is going to be bread and butter stuff for most of you, but I'll just spell it out again. At the top there, you have this concept of the controller, this kind of negotiating updates between your view and your model. So when the view changes, maybe the user's pressed a button or navigated to some link, those user actions are going to notify the controller. The controller will update your back-end model if necessary. And likewise, if your back-end data changes your model, that should notify your controller, and the controller should update the view. And Angular is very much written around that core concept. So let's have a look. Declarative two-way data binding. Right. So some of you might have used server-side templates before. We certainly use them. So what that typically means is you write your HTML with some placeholders, and then the server will handle rendering that HTML, injecting in the correct data, and that's what gets served up to your client. Okay, that's very much a one-time thing. You render your template, you serve it up. Angular's all about two-way data binding. So you have that initial compilation step into your view that's done client-side, but it's not a one-time thing. If your model changes, the template gets updated, the view gets updated, and vice versa. Okay? Dynamic templating, I will show you a demo of. Okay. So I'm going to start off with a pretty bare bones HTML page here. Okay, that works. Cool.
Your horizontal one is in there because you did a /HR. Source not HR/.
Okay. So here's an example of a really simple app. Okay. Now, what I'd like to be able to do is enter my name, and for that to show up. Right? Now, apologies if any of you have seen this before, because it is pretty much ripped straight from the Angular tutorial. But if we weren't using Angular, I have to start using jQuery, and it just gets a bit messy. And I don't really want to use JavaScript at all, because this should be something simple, right? So watch how easy it is to turn this into an Angular app. I reference the Angular library. It's coming straight from Google's thing. Right up here, I kind of have to specify that my page is going to be an Angular app. And the way I do that is I say ng app. So what will happen is when the page is loaded and becomes ready, Angular will look through the DOM for that ng app and kind of identify it as, okay, that's the root of my app. That's what that means. And then what I'll do here, Great. Okay, so that blew my mind when I saw it. Like, maybe that's not amazing for people that have done web development for years, but I thought it was pretty cool to be able to do that without any JavaScript. Yeah, so I've just reiterated there, the way we made this into like an Angular app is we bring in the Angular lib, we put ng app at the root of our page. I'm specifying, I'm using this ng model, okay? Now this is one of those Angular tags I mentioned. So this is one of the ways they're kind of extending what you can do with HTML. So by specifying ng model, what I'm saying is whatever's typed into this input field, I want it to be known as user. I'm kind of binding it to that model name. And then below that, I use the double curly braces, that's how it kind of does its templating, to say replace that with the value of user. Okay? Any questions?
So could you have that model? Could that be an actual object?
Yeah, so we'll go on, we'll get more complicated. So, I mean, that model, and this is a simple example, you wouldn't normally specify it in your HTML. Your model would more likely be your database on your server.
But that would be in a server farm, that would
Yeah.
be kind of a server model. You
Yeah.
have to have something, product model, to do that, and you would have to declaratively write that model on the client side or somewhere in the page.
Yes, I think I'm going to get onto what you're talking about. Yeah, so that's all great, but as soon as we want to start doing something a bit more complicated, which I think is what you're talking about, you know, we can't go on just polluting our HTML with all these horrible bindings. So what Angular does is it's got this concept of a controller. Okay, so controller is just a bit of JavaScript that's responsible for, I don't want to say manipulating the DOM, but it's kind of responsible for a certain portion of the DOM. Okay, and there's another component that Angular provides called services, which are just JavaScript components. And one of the major JavaScript Angular services is this scope, $scope. And what that service does is it kind of provides that two-way data binding between your HTML and your controller, or your JavaScript. What I want to be able to do, yeah, let's do this. Let's put a button in here. And I'm going to use another Angular tag called ngClick. And in here I'm going to specify some function that doesn't exist yet, but we'll sort that out. The other thing I'm going to do is I need to specify, I'm going to write a controller. I need to tell it which portion of my page it's responsible for. So I'm going to put it up here on my body. We use another Angular tag called ngController. We'll just call this sample controller. And then let's get rid of all of that. And I can call this whatever I want. I'm going to call it greeting. So that greeting, there's no model currently in the page that is going to replace that. So I need to write my backend controller. Let's call this. Yes. Before I forget. Okay. And I know I'm putting my scripts at the top of the page, which is bad. Whatever. My manager's not here. Okay. Controller, there's nothing clever and fancy here. I'll explain that in a sec. But that's a controller. It's an Angular controller. Okay, dead simple. That's $scope service I was talking about. All I have to do is mention it there as a function parameter, and Angular will take care of doing the dependency injection and making sure it's there for me. So at no point in my code I'm going to have to do like a new scope and make sure I'm doing a singleton or anything like that. It does it all for you. Here, say scope dot do something. Here's the function. Takes no parameters, and when it's pressed, and remember I said that $scope is kind of the way that Angular handles the binding between your view and your back-end JavaScript. That's what this $scope is letting me do. It's letting me reference things which are on the scope of my controller. So here, if I just said Ben, hopefully, yeah, there we go, better. So we can get smarter. And here, we can say scope dot. I think I could. Yeah. Okay, so I have my controller. I'm just declaring that there should be one function. And that's what I'll do something it's going to call. And I'm just going to set that scope.greeting equal to hello plus whatever the username is. So here, Jeremy. Hello, Jeremy. Yeah? You guys all seen this, right?
I haven't.
If I was in the audience and I'd seen this, I'd be like, what? That's crazy.
What? That's crazy.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so that's kind of as easy as it gets in terms of writing control. Is that what you were talking about in terms of?
Yeah, I mean, because that's okay for simple apps.
Yeah.
When we're looking at a data-driven business-oriented apps, big apps,
Yeah.
you're going to have to write these as a separate controllers with the objects. So for example, an object called a person, fields and validation and all those have to be written as a separate.
Yeah. So I think what you're perhaps talking about, I might be wrong, is you want to write like another Angular service and be able to use it. Yeah, so you can definitely do that. It's all JavaScript, right?
Yeah.
Dependency injection. So we kind of saw dependency injection at a very limited scale because I was using that $scope without really having to do anything. And if I'd written my own services, like a person service, I would just say person, and it would instantiate it for me, and you get hold of that. So as soon as I'm starting to write multiple controllers for different parts of my page, typically they're going to want to start to share code. Okay, so the way Angular handles that is it allows you to write your own services. So remember the $scope is a service, and we can write our own. So typically your services would be your web services, maybe authentication, everything really. All your business logic should be in services. Controllers should literally just handle calling your service, maybe doing a tiny bit of mangling, and kind of setting the view up. So that's how you kind of start to share code.
With services, is that a server side?
No services can be client side, and then I guess inside your services you do
Making
HTTP.
it index call or
Yeah.
HTTP.
Definitely. And in fact, one of the services that Angular provides out of the box is a $HTTP. So you kind of get all that free. You just do $HTTP.get. Just get back your JSON objects. So this is called demo writing and using a service. but I'm too lazy to write a service, so we'll use the HTTP one. So, what I'm going to quickly need to do for this is set myself up a little node server, because I want to write a little server API to return some data. So, has everyone used Node? No? Okay, so just quickly, this is probably a subject of a whole other talk, right? But Node is JavaScript on your server side, right? So it's not in the browser, it's just its own JavaScript engine. Runs on top of V8, the Chrome engine. And what Node does is it comes with this thing called Node Package Manager, which is, you can kind of tell it to install these open source packages that are on some repository somewhere. So I just typed npm init because that's gonna spit me out like my own little skeletal Node package. Not really explaining it very well. Who does Ruby? What's the equivalent of Ruby? They have their own package.
Gems.
Gems, yeah. Okay, so it's kind of similar to Gems.
NuGet package?
Hmm?
Like a NuGet package?
Yeah, exactly. Kind of. Let me just whiz through this. This is sort of crap.
Well, that's important.
Yeah. Okay, all that's done. Ignore that, it's not fire. If we look at this, just generate this package.json file for me. Because what it's anticipating is that I'm about to write my own Node package and eventually want to push it up to that repository I'm talking about. The next thing I'm going to do is just quickly install some of the dependencies I'm going to need for this little simple Node server. So, yeah, I mean, this doesn't matter for the purposes of the demo, but Express is just like a web framework, so you don't have to write such low-level code. Question?
This question, can the service be of any other language, right? Usually .NET service or
No,
Java?
so for Angular to be able to use it as a service, it's got to be JavaScript, and you do have to write your service in a special way. You kind of have to register your service with Angular. But inside that service, you're free to do whatever you want. So your service might just be a wrapper for a single HTTP request. It's more complicated stuff on your server. Yeah, so all I've done there, this doesn't matter, but it's just pulled down Express as a Node module. So what I can do now is just quickly try and get together my app. This is what Express has given me, by the way. If you haven't used it, it just gives you these nice wrappers. So you can say app.get and just specify a page or whatever. I'm just specifying if any request comes in at the root, I can serve up whatever I want. What did I call it? Hello. I'm quickly going to set up this data endpoint I was talking about. So when a request comes in for /data, I'll make it just serve up some crap. So I can just send a raw JavaScript logic back, so I'll do greet. Hello. Final bit. hop back here. Should in theory. Cool. Except it's not working. Okay, that's fine. Oh, I know why. It's because it's trying to get Angular from my server. JS.
Sure, hello world.
So it's because I needed to provide kind of override. Static. That's what it was missing. Oh, yes. Spotted.
Grunt what?
Excellent. Okay. Cool, that still works. And now it's being served up by my little simple web service. And all of that was just so I could show you this next bit, which was consuming a service. So I'm going to use a built-in one that Angular provides, the $HTTP. But this could just be my own Ben's web API that does some extra stuff like authentication, and then itself uses perhaps HTTP as a dependency.
Is the dollar like just a convention? Or?
Yeah, it's a convention within Angular.
It's got nothing to do with jQuery or
I believe so.
No, it's just a Angular convention. So anything
Yeah.
begins with dollar is a
Angular.
internal
Yeah.
Angular service or object.
Yeah, so if it, I just would omit the $sign for my services. Okay, so now I've specified that additional services dependency, I can just go ahead and use it. So I'll get that data endpoint I set up. And then this is one way of doing it. Okay, so all I've done there is this HTTP exposes this get method. I'm asking for data, and out of convenience, I'm just calling .success, one of the callbacks it provides. Right. Let's chuck that in there. Actually, I'll screw format and I'll put it there so we can create it. What I should be able to do is stop greeting, I think I called it. Let's try that. In fact, it's not even you reading that. Click me. It's hello, so that's coming back from my server. So, I know this is all pretty noddy stuff, but in terms of what I've been able to do with so little code, I think it's impressive. You know, if I had to write all that from scratch, let's just make this a bit better. Say plus. Okay, so ignore the spacing issue, but I'm starting to do all kinds of cool stuff. I'm taking user input from my thing, it's going into my controller is using a service, bringing data, pushing it together, updating the view. You know, I've not really touched my HTML at all, which is great. Any questions so far? No? Cool. So, let's see where we are. Okay, so we've written a controller, we've written a service, we haven't written a service. So I mentioned HTTP and scope as the built-in Angular ones. There's actually a load more. I've called out some of the more interesting ones there. So $resource is kind of like $HTTP, except it's geared up towards RESTful endpoints. So you can can specify a kind of REST resource in a very expressive manner and take care of that. $Q is a promise library. So if you haven't heard of promises, it's kind of a way just to do async code. So you can write a JavaScript function that returns a promise, and it's literally a promise of what might be returned later. So it's just a way of passing around async futures and stuff. Cache factory is what it sounds like. That $locale, so it will handle localization and internationalization for you, which is very cool. Cookie store, so if you want to start getting smart with cookies and remember me, things like that, it's helpful for that. And $log as well, which is kind of boring. But you find, apart from the $HTTP, you just write your own. It's so simple. So we've seen a few of the new tags. What Angular lets you do as well is write your own HTML tags. They call them directives, okay? So this really allows you to express your HTML beautifully. Because instead of having a huge, perhaps pages-long chunk of HTML that's divs and spans and all sorts, it might just be like a login form. And perhaps on another page you want to use that again, so you copy and paste it. I could write my login form and take all that HTML that I've written and put it into an Angular directive, okay, which I'll show you in a second. All I've done there is Angular lets you write custom directives in a few different ways. So as like a raw HTML element, or kind of as an attribute, or whatever that is, another attribute. Yeah. So let's quickly write one of those. So if we go back to my HTML, which I haven't touched up to now, what I'd like to be able to do, imagine I'm writing a page which has a widget on it that I want to use all over the place. And my widget in this case is this little greeting nonsense. What I'd like to be able to do is say, my greeting widget, like that. So let's try and get that working. If I save that, here. I'll explain what that is in a second. What I'm quickly going to do is I'm going to create another HTML file for that chunk I was talking about. So we'll call that greeting.html. Let's go back here. So that. So you can start to see how this really starts making your HTML so much cleaner. And the app we're writing internally at the moment has been wonderful. Because, we package up things like tables, huge chunks of HTML as directives. And write them very generically and enables you to reuse the code all over the place. So chuck that there. Pop back to my JavaScript. Okay, what I've done there on the top line is, up to now, because I've just written this simple controller that's referenced straight from the HTML, I haven't really had to do anything else apart from that. What I'm going to start to do now is write directives and controllers. So I need a reference to my Angular app, so I can kind of chain them on top of it. So all I'm saying here is, my Angular app should be called demo. That's all it is. Back in my HTML, I'm kind of specifying it there. So what Angular lets you do in theory is write multiple apps within the same page, multiple modules. And it's just another way to separate your code. But, maybe just write it one. So we do that. And the way we write a directive is we say my app.directive, we give it a name, we call it my greeting object. Okay. look what it's called there, my dash greeting dash widget. Look what I've called it. That's one of the first things that took me hours to fix when I started looking at Angular. And none of this is really documented anywhere. So you have to write, I don't even know what this is called. You had a word for it, didn't you? Snake case or?
Yeah, snake casing, I think.
Snake
Yeah.
casing.
Is that a real word?
It is now. How do you hear that? So, whereas back in JavaScript, it requires camel casing. Do you know the reason why, Chris? Isn't it? Oh, I know why. It's because it's case insensitive. That's right. The HTML is case insensitive. So there is a kind of vague reason why they do it. But anyway, when you go after this and you start writing your Angular apps, just remember that. Function. Just move that off the screen. So that's a directive, right? That's as simple as it is to write a directive in Angular. I can inject stuff again, so I know I'm going to be using HTTP, so I'll pop that in there. Now this directive has to return. I mean, this is, you have to use a quite specific syntax here for the directive in Angular. It's not quite as generic as my controller. I'll explain this in a sec. Okay, so this top line is purely optional, but what I'm basically saying is when you're in my directive and you eventually resolve my chunk of HTML, I want you to replace my greeting widget with the contents of it. Otherwise it would just put it kind of as a child of it. This next line, the restrict E. Remember I said there were the different ways to write directives? I can specify that my directive should only be written as an element or an attribute, or there's some other ones. Typically element or attribute is what we use. This template's the cool stuff. I mean, in here I can start writing raw HTML, and that's what's going to get swapped into the view. But what I want to do is specify a separate file entirely, so we can say template URL, and this will be my greeting.html. This next line is a link function. So this is a function that's going to get executed when your directive is compiled. And you get these lovely parameters, scope, element, and attrs. So with the scope, remember what you saw in the controller, that means I can start manipulating the scope inside my directive. I can do raw DOM manipulation if I want to. So I can say element, find by ID, all that rubbish. And I get a list of attributes as well. So on my directive, I'm not actually passing any attributes, but what this lets you do is we could start saying stuff like data equals, okay? You start specifying parameters. So you can write a really nice generic directive, and every time you use it, you can be passing in different data. It's great. But we won't do that for this one. Sure.
A comma.
Oh, yes. A pastry. So what we can do here, remember we're still just using this HTML I pulled out. So just as a simple, just to show you what I could do, I could go straight in and just set the scope greeting. So in theory, oh, it is. Oh. Yeah, okay. So Angular's run. It's spotted my directive in the DOM. It's gone, compiled my directive. I've replaced it with that. So you can see there's nothing there but hello. Ignore the MG binding. That's just some internals that Angular's done. It's there, essentially. That's it, we'll get a bit clever. Let's grab this, I'm going to copy and paste Bandit. Just about there. Some this.
It's just one too many braces.
Okay, so here, when my directive's compiled, I'm actually going to make an AJAX call, get my data, and then I'll set the greeting with the username. So in theory,
Because you took that brace from the controller, the controller's broken.
oh yeah, I didn't move on that. No. Thank you. Should have moved off the screen. Say that again, Jimmy?
I think it's the dollar on the screen.
Oh yeah, you're right. Thank you. That was close enough.
You have to pass the dollar scope through to the widget in the direction of the
No,
you
so
can intrinsically get access to
yeah, so what's happening is, that's a good point, thanks. Previously on my controllers I've passed through scope. With a directive, it kind of, by virtue of it being a directive, you kind of capture the scope of the surroundings. If you wanted to, you can, and you should do this in fact, you can go and write a more restrictive scope in here. So I think in here we can say all I want available in my scope is variable X and variable Y. Okay. The other thing it lets you do, I can't remember the syntax, is you would do something like var, is it equals?
Wait,
So something like that. So if you wanted to, you could say, in terms of, you're saying the only thing I want available on the scope is this variable that's available when the directive's compiled. And you should write your directives like this. I glossed over it for the purposes of the demo. You should write it like this. So,
So can I ask, what's available in scope? What is scope?
well, it's the age-old question. It's
Is it DOM?
yeah, in terms of what I've done at the moment, it'll be, yeah, the scope of this element.
No, but so if you think about, you have multiple directives,
Yeah,
right? And that everything made up as is a DOM. That's what I'm saying.
yeah.
So what's the difference then in your the other file there? You have scope plus element plus attribute. So why not just have a scope in there, because scope, if scope contains a DOM, you would be able to use scope to manipulate DOM if you want to. Or if scope
Yeah.
is something else.
So, I don't get what you're getting at. That's what I'm doing there, right? I'm manipulating my DOM essentially, but that is in this fragment here.
I think what it means is everything that's element and attributes is already contained within the scope, so why do you need to separate them out? Surely you can get to any of the element or the attributes via the scope, because that's essentially the DOM.
Or the service-oriented architecture.
Okay.
And you can, but you really don't want to do that if you're building a big app.
Yeah.
I'm missing something. Say that again. Sorry.
So if scope contains the DOM,
Yeah.
then element and attributes are already contained within the DOM.
Yeah.
So therefore, you should be able to access everything just via scope without having to use element or attributes, in theory.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I shouldn't.
No, yeah, I don't use it, but
Right,
I can see why you
Yeah.
wouldn't
Okay,
necessarily
fine.
need to add those two extras.
Okay. I'm trying to fix this up. Did anyone spot an error?
They do something with the
That's all right. Okay. Right. Yeah, I don't think that's going to fix the error, but because
Can you diagnose the problem by demonstrating how to use the log?
yeah, I should be able to. I haven't actually used log myself. Let's fix this up.
You move controls from the body.
Yeah. No, I don't need that. Oh, that is working. Sorry. I was saying it's wrong. It's because all we did was find out that. But, just for giggles, let's say. I know it's because I need to watch.
No, I don't think so.
Because it's a different scope.
No.
It's not.
Let's gloss over that for now. But I did have it working earlier. Okay?
Works on my machine.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's the guts of how you write a custom directive anyway. And, I mean, I'd love to give some future talks on, writing complicated directives, because we have made some really great use of them.
In terms of folder structure, could you have those directives as sort of greetings.html?
Yeah. And in fact, that's exactly what we do. We
Okay.
have a separate folder called partials. Yeah, they're all in there.
Yeah, that's cool.
We actually go further than that. As an aside, perhaps just for you, we have a grunt task that turns our HTML partials into raw JavaScript.
Okay.
So here we do template URL. What actually happens under the covers here is, if this is the second time this directive is being used, Angular's not going to make another call to go to greeting.html. Angular's cached that. And what we kind of abuse that, in fact. We convert all our partials into JavaScript as a grunt task. And then that JavaScript is included in the page.
Okay.
And then when our page is loaded, we call an Angular service, I think, like a cache factory, similar though. And we basically preload all our partials.
Okay.
Because we have so many of them, we found that we were making really frequent calls just to get all these little bits of HTML. And they were that small, but once you put them all into JavaScript, compress them, you'll find it was tiny. Okay, so we've seen some of the built-in directives. Angular's got loads more as well. So there's the event directives like ng-click, which I used, double-click, mouse enter, mouse leave, ng-change. So if I put ng-change on a input box, the thing's going to get triggered whenever that changes. ng-app, that's the boring one. ng-bind is just a very raw way of binding something to an HTML element. ng-show and ng-hide. This is pretty cool, easy to demo. So let's see if we can do this. So imagine in here I had hello and my greeting, right? So now it's saying hello, hello, undefined. But ignore that. I kind of don't want it to say hello until that's available. So what we can do is we can say ng show, and I can just write any expression I want in here. It could be a function, but I'll just say username. Everything's modeled up. So if I do that, in theory I don't get it until there's something in the model. Okay, so that's a pretty useful one. So you'll hide big portions of your app until it's all ready. And ng hides the same thing, but just flipped. ng style is just a way to modify CSS styling things. ng disabled. ng disabled, so that's if you want. That's basically going to manipulate the disabled attribute on the elements that support it. Likewise for ng checked. ng repeat is another very cool one. So I'll quickly show you a demo of that. So just get rid of that. Let's get rid of that. Now imagine I had an array of objects coming back from my server. I'm going to get rid of that. So I've got some list, and perhaps the objects that are coming back from my server have a name, right? So I'm going to return back a number of greetings from my server. So I'm going to say greeting.name. Okay, that's what I want to display multiple times in my list. So up here, I can use that ng repeat directive, and I can say, this is just like a loop, I can just say greeting in all the greetings. Greetings. That's better. So if I do that now, in my directive, let's set, instead of greeting, let's set scope.greetings equal to response.greetings. So I'm going to have to modify my server to return that. Get rid of that, it's just fluff. So back to my node server quickly. I'm going to say greeting. This will just be a JavaScript array. Okay, that should work. List, let's see if that works. Always forget that. We do actually, like Jamie said, we have a grunt task that just watches for any changes in our JavaScript. And we'll just restart our node server. And that's, I know Jamie mentioned it, but grunt is great. If you're not using it, you should be. I mean, we've got it set up so if we touch a CSS file, it does all the CSS related tasks. If we touch JS, it's doing JS related tasks. In fact, if we touch any of our JS, it runs all the unit tests. So as you're typing, it's continually running tests. Interesting. Oh, I know what it is. I'm an idiot. It's because there's no name on that. It's not greeting. Okay, that's better. But if it was a more complex JavaScript object, I think I can do that. So that's ng repeat. It's very useful. So you know I mentioned we had a table directive. In our table directive, the actual fragment of HTML is quite small because we were able to say ng repeat property and object, and that's our table rows. So everything's named very generically, but then the consumer of that directive is able to pass in the object that they want the table to represent. It's fantastic.
So you can do a repeat within a repeat? So you're going to repeat for the rows and then repeat for the columns?
I've not tried that, but I don't see why you wouldn't be able
In
to.
theory, just throw it a model
Yeah,
of data and you just
well,
create
let's try it. It's dead simple. No, we have tried to do this before. I think we have to get clever.
Do you?
Yeah.
You do.
Don't you have to do like, you have to basically get the parent, we'll try it quickly. So in here, so this will be food. I don't think it's going to work. There is a way to do this.
Yeah, it's similar to
Line
twig
has
or
to be
smart.
food, doesn't it?
Yeah, refer
Yeah,
to
sorry.
parent.
Yeah, there is definitely a way to do it
Mm.
because I have done it before. But just for keeping us to try it. Greeting music's food greeting. So this is going to, man, this is going to be a mess. This is going to be,
Ben, we can leave it like that. We'll do the characters, won't you? Do each character in the string.
oh no, yeah, let's try it. Yes.
No, but
Okay, I'm going to leave that because we could fiddle with it
Yeah,
all night.
no,
There's
that's
definitely a way to do it.
Okay.
And that ng repeat, there's other special reserved words you can use to get things like the parent index. So if you wanted to do a table that says
Iterations.
one, yeah, there's loads of stuff. Okay, and there's loads more directives. I mean, it's pages and pages long. These are just the interesting ones. Angular also has filters. So what this lets you do is we just pipe and we specify the name of the filter. Here I'm using a built-in Angular one called currency, and it will basically determine the current locale and output the relevant formatting. And go on.
is that a newer version? Because currency didn't used to support pound signs, it used to be dollars.
Oh, does it?
It just come out with a dollar.
I guessed that it would be able to do that. If it can't, that's shocking.
Most people extend currency to support pound signs.
Do they?
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, we've not actually had to use it yet. Kind of doing our own localization stuff, but that's good to know. In theory, it should work, right? And there's other ones like number, so you specify the number of precision you want.
So that's the times and lookup.
Yes. Yeah, as an aside, we're currently making use of another, it's a service with its own filter that we use for translation. So we write our DOM, all the labels are just expressed in English, but the HTML elements just have this translate attribute, and that's its own service that's doing translation. Last bit. So Angular is built from the ground up to be unit testable. So because it's kind of forced you to write this lovely separated code, everything's very modular, everything's very sort of standalone, there's not many dependencies, and it's very unit testable. And in fact, out the box, you know, imagine I wanted to unit test my controller, I've injected HTTP. If I try and unit test that, we're currently using Karma and Jasmine. It complains because there's some HTTP request that it wasn't expecting. So Angular even ships with a service called $HTTP backend, which you can use to kind of mock up the HTTP requests. So you still use Angular's HTTP service, but when it actually, under the covers, goes to do the AJAX request, it's using whatever the mock data is you've specified on the HTTP backend. Angular's also got a load of constructs for serving out mock your other objects. I didn't explain that very well. So imagine my controller's not using $HTTP, but using my own service. Well, I don't care about that service. I'm just trying to unit test my controller in isolation. Angular's got constructs in place that allow me to say, when this service is requested, just serve up this object. Or serve up this object with these stub functions, because I don't care, right? So it's absolutely brilliant in terms of unit testing. So you'd be a fool not to unit test your Angular stuff. that's the end of my presentation. Sorry it's been a bit of a slog. And I'm sorry if you guys have all seen this before, but hopefully at least some of you haven't.